Own the Road with Kelly and Bob, the USA 250 Tour, celebrating America. Coming up on this episode...
Slavery, rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton made the South Carolina colony the richest of the original 13 colonies. Now, those millions of pounds of rice were farmed and processed by the enslaved Africans, using their knowledge, their skills to do that.
We, the people of the United States of America.
Hi, and thanks for joining us for this episode of On the Road with Kelly and Bob, the USA 250 Tour. I'm Kelly Phillips.
And I'm Bob Phillips. When you travel all over the U.S., as we have been doing this year, visiting every state, you come to realize the diversity of our population. And even among people who might look and sound very much alike, you come to learn that their roots are sometimes very different.
And that's the way it is with one group of Americans who are primarily concentrated in North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. We're talking about the Gullah Geechee.
Gullah Geechee. Or you can just call us Gullah. It's basically a regional thing. So North Carolina, South Carolina, we Tanese Gullah. Georgia, Florida, they Tanese Geechee. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. My father is Gullah Geechee and Cape Verdean. That's where the Rodriguez comes in. It was funny in Texas. I had never lived in a place before where little old ladies would say, well, why don't you speak Spanish? And then I would have to explain to them that it was Portuguese. We lived up and down the East Coast. My father started out as a chemist for like the FDA. And then he went to law school when we were living in the Boston area, and he became a lawyer. But as a little girl, I liked bugs and frogs and newts, but I was also into reading and comic books. Now that I look back on some of my interests, I know a little bit on the autism spectrum.
Are we all?
I'm a little neurodivergent or neurospicy, as I've heard it referred to nowadays. Because I used to read the encyclopedia when I was a kid. I loved reading the encyclopedia.
You could learn so much. Yes.
So anyway.
Janet Rodriguez and her sister Beatrice grew up a lot like many other American kids, but they were always very aware of their somewhat different heritage. That's because their parents made sure they were aware of where they came from.
And today, where they came from and the story that goes with it is in an area that these two sisters know very well.
The descendants of the enslaved Africans that were brought to the southeastern coast of the United States to work the rice, the indigo, Sea Island cotton plantations.
On slave ships.
Yes. Or as we like to think of them, floating prisons, because that's what...
Same thing.
Mm-hmm. That's what they were. So when the English came to settle South Carolina, they had a lot of ideas. They brought a lot of different seeds and things with them. They tried silkworms. They tried oranges. They tried a lot of different things. But one of the things they saw are pluffed mud soil in this big, huge, marshy area is perfect for growing rice. Now, last time I looked, you don't grow rice in England, so they were at a loss there. But they knew where people did grow rice, and that was West Africa. Those rice farmers in West Africa have been growing rice for thousands of years.
The Gullah Geechee, or as Janet likes to point out, a subgroup of a subgroup mixed in with the rest of our country's population.
Of course, there are lots of those in the United States. One main difference, though, is that the Gullah Geechee have worked overtime to make sure that even though they have assimilated into this society, their roots are never lost.
We speak the oldest English-based Creole in the United States.
Can you give us a sample of that?
Have you sung Kumbaya?
Yes.
That is a Gullah Geechee song. Kumbaya, come by here. It was a plea, come by here, my lord, to come and help us get out of this situation. So anybody who sung Kumbaya has sung Gullah. If you have used the word bubba, gumbo, jitters, juke, you have spoken Gullah. Those are all Gullah words that have made their way into standard American English.
We're in my mind.
Yeah, the word gumbo is literally an African word for okra. So, if anybody ever serves you a gumbo that doesn't have okra in it, that is not gumbo.
It ain't gumbo. And today, as part of their efforts to, one, keep the Gullah Geechee culture alive, and two, make sure others have at least some knowledge of the Gullah Geechee history and culture, Janet and Beatrice carry on the family's legacy, a Gullah Geechee Museum in Georgetown, South Carolina.
Several things that are my favorite things here at the museum. This sweetgrass basket is one of my favorite, and I love this basket because it's just so beautiful, and it just shows the artistry of Gullah Geechee sweetgrass sowers. In some African cultures, if a girl did not reach womanhood unless she could make a basket that could float over water.
And a tour of this Gullah Geechee Museum might include these sisters' attempts to set the record straight on what they say are some errors in our history.
People talk a lot about the South, and they like to say that slavery was a Southern problem and it was only the South that benefited. The whole entire nation benefited. The boats for the slave trade were made where? In New England. There was a type of cloth that was specifically made that plantation owners could buy and give to their enslaved so their enslaved could make clothing for themselves. The slave cloth was made where? New England. It was a symbiotic economy.
Did you hear of these stories growing up from parents and
Some of
grandparents?
them, because my mother both my parents were history nerds. And my mother was very proud of being Gullah Geechee, although she was born in the 30s. During that period, and for a long time, probably up until the last 20 or 30 years, we were made to feel that we were less than because we're Gullah Geechee. And that was from everybody. We are very different in our cultural practices. We are very different in our religious, our music, all of these different things. These were things that we were made fun of for. But they were also things that fascinated everybody else. So there's so many different ways that Gullah Geechee people, we have helped shape America in the world, and most people don't know about it. And it's for several different reasons. We are a subgroup inside of a subgroup, ethnic subgroup here in the United States. So yes, I am African American, but I am also Gullah Geechee.
In spite of our questionable decisions and in the history of our country, are you proud to be an American?
Here's the thing that people don't understand about many Black Americans. We love America despite herself. We helped create this country. We aren't going anywhere.
A couple of points. First, you can find Gullah Geechee people all over the country, but especially in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida.
And there are other Gullah Geechee museums, and they are all worth visiting.
Second, these two sisters are fascinating people, and we suggest you go by and chat with them yourselves should you find yourself in Georgetown, South Carolina, which is in and of itself very worth the trip.
It certainly is. Okay, let's pick up the conversation and learn more about the Gullah Geechee people and about what Janet and Beatrice are doing.
The heaviest concentration of Gullah Geechee people are in what the federal government refers to as the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. We are one of those regional areas under the auspices of the National Park Service. I told you before, it goes from North Carolina down to northern Florida. That's just the highest concentration. During the Great Migration, Gullah Geechee people did what Black people in the South did. They went to find work. They went to find opportunity for themselves and their children. So I have Gullah Geechee relatives in California that we just visited. I had Gullah Geechee relatives in Texas. I have Gullah Geechee relatives in New York and Massachusetts. So we're everywhere. The first big cash crop for South Carolina was indigo dye. So for folks who don't know what indigo dye is, that's the stuff that makes our jeans blue. So the British didn't know how to do that either. But once again, they knew who did. Even though some of the history books will still to this day make it seem like some young lady, Eliza Pickney, some 16-year-old girl, was the one that really invented and learned how to process it, it wasn't. These are things that the enslaved Africans, specifically probably those from like Nigeria and Mali, where to this day there's still an indigo dye making tradition, and the cloth and the things that they dye with it is just amazing. Anyway, processing the dye is a difficult thing, and it was a very secretive thing in Africa. It was secret. They had secret societies. They did not share this knowledge because it was a way to make money, right? So when they came here, they brought that knowledge, the same way they brought the knowledge on how to create rice plantations. That was really the first big cash crop for Georgetown. The city that we're in now was indigo dye. Indigo dye making, disgusting, because at the first process to use in the fermentation liquid that they put the indigo plants into, urine.
No.
Oh, yes. Because what does urine turn into? Ammonia. Did you know that was what Native Americans would use to dye the deer skins white?
I had no idea.
Urine, yeah. So they would have these huge vats, and they would bring the indigo plants. They would put them in the vats, and then they would be crushing them down during this process. During the process, they're crushing the plant down in this fermentation liquid, and what they then do, they would take that stuff at the bottom, they would put it in these long, narrow trays, spread it out, they would let it dry, and they'd dry into indigo dye cakes. Once upon a time in the colonial period, you could pay your taxes with indigo dye cakes. It was called blue gold in South Carolina.
It was so
because
valuable.
it was so valuable. Now that was going gangbusters for about 40 to 60 years. And then something that we're celebrating this year happened. We declared our independence. And the English decided, well, even though you're our colony and one of the reasons why we created you was to make products for us and send them back we're not going to pay you to fight us. So they stopped buying, because that's where most of South Carolina's indigo dye went, and went back to England. And they used it for clothing, for fabric, for to make the beautiful blue patterns of that white china, everything. And it was also used to create the color purple, which, as you know, was a royal color. And then then came the rise of rice. So you can Google and you can find placards for back in that colonial period and after, where they specifically say bringing in a ship of Guineamen, because that's what they called them in that area. Guineamen. And once they knew that, that would tell the buyer that these are rice farmers. And that's who we want. because the original coast of South Carolina and other parts of the southeastern United States did not look the way they looked. They look now, back in that colonial period. For instance, South Carolina, this part of coastal South Carolina was a maritime forest. So think of a heavily forested swamp with huge primeval gum trees and cypress trees that had never been cut. When they first brought the ancestors over, the first thing they were put to work doing was cutting down those trees with, clearing out the vegetation. They had to drain the swamp, then they leveled the land, and then they could build the infrastructure for a rice plantation. Growing rice is a very technical crop. It brings in a whole lot of different sciences, from hydroponics to engineering. The British didn't know how to do any of this. So the growing season is from March to October, November. Now, during that time period, the ancestors were basically left alone to do the work of growing the rice and then processing the rice. So they had a job to do and they did it. One of the reasons why we were able to retain more Africanisms, and an Africanism is anything that somebody in the African diaspora does that can be traced directly back to Africa. So in the United States, Gullah Geechee people, we were trained more than any other ethnic group, any other descendants of enslaved Africans anyplace else. And as Texans, I'm quite sure you are familiar with what I like to consider the Louisiana industrial gumbo complex. Because when you Google gumbo, it would make you think that gumbo was invented in Louisiana and that's the only place they make it. Well, gumbo was not invented in Louisiana. They were not the first ones to do it. The first one, right, as my mother would say, in South Carolina. Remember, South Carolina was settled and they brought their enslaved people here before Louisiana. So my ancestors were the ones who were trying to replicate okra stew, which is a very common dish in West Africa. That's what they were trying to do with many of these foods that are referred to as soul foods or Southern foods. These are actually African foods. They were the attempts of enslaved Africans to replicate the foods that they ate at home. So the reason why you cook greens down low and slow is that is an West African cooking technique. Jambalaya is the sister of something called jollof rice. In West Africa, that's the most popular rice dish.
Tell us about the place we're in now.
Well, if some piece of American history happened from Jacksonville, Wilmington, North Carolina, down to St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Florida, on the barrier islands or 30 miles inland, that is Gullah Geechee history. It's not just Black history. It's not just American history. It's Gullah Geechee history. This is out of my mother's brain. And my father was her researcher, as I like to say. Everybody was Bunny's researchers. My mother's real name was Vermel Earline Smith Rodriguez, but everybody called her Bunny. And Bunny is a basket name. That's a tradition that Gullah Geechee people used to have, where you had your government name, and then you had the private name that people in your family called. And it's an African tradition. She was very proud of her heritage. She was a history nerd. So was my father. So even though I am 60 and I grew up during a time when going to the bookstore and finding Black books, it was few and far between, my parents were Black book hoarders. So throughout my childhood, there was always a library of Black history books and Black culture books in our household. You know, my parents had subscriptions to all the magazines, Ebony, Jet. So, and we were a reading family. So, and my mother would tell us stories, more so as I got older. And so my mother, she opened a shop on Pawleys Island, and she called it the Gullah Boutique and Gift Shop, or I forget the whole entire name. And in it, she had her beautiful story quilts. These are the quilts you see in the museum around you. All of these quilts are quilts that relate to Gullah Geechee history and to Black history, and of course, it's all American history. So my mother, when you came into her shop, you would learn about Gullah Geechee history and our culture. That is how my mother was. And that's how interesting and fascinating our history and culture is. At one point, somebody came in and told Bunny, this is not a shop. This is a museum. And my mother was like, you got a point. And so that's when the transition went from being the Gullah shop to being the Gullah Museum. We like to say that the Gullah Museum dates back to 1997.
As you look at our culture and you look at our history, where did the idea that we could own people ever become a good idea? And why was it so prevalent for so long?
That I'm going to try and be as simplistic as I can because that's a very complicated thing.
Yeah, it is.
Slavery is nothing new in the world. Everybody had it.
Yeah.
They had slavery on the African continent. But what the Europeans decided to do was to make it generational and to only focus on one ethnic group. They focused on the Africans.
Why?
Because they needed them. Remember, the first people who came here and got these amazing land grants, they were second and third sons of wealthy families. They didn't know how to do pretty much anything. They didn't have enough white people to do the work that they wanted to do. So that's where they went to Africa. Now, if you go and you take a group of people who look very different from you and very different from the native people of a land, you take them 5,000 miles from anything they know, you subject them to hyper-violence, which meant anything from cutting off limbs to rape, they're going to do what you tell them to do. It's going to be very difficult for them to escape because you are going to send, slave catchers after them. But also, since they look so different, it's not as if they can blend in. That is also one of the reasons why in South Carolina, they would enslave Native Americans, indigenous folks, and they would sell them to be enslaved on plantations in the Caribbean. Thousands of miles away, no place to go, no way to escape. So that is why the focus was on the Africans. Rice for us now is something we go to the supermarket and buy or order off of Amazon. It's not a fancy food. But back then, rice was a big deal. The slavery, rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton made the South Carolina colony the richest of the original 13 colonies. Now, those millions of pounds of rice were farmed and processed by the enslaved Africans using their knowledge, their skills to do that. So it amuses me when people talk about slavery and enslaved people like they just tossed us on these plantations and told us what to do. That may have been how it was in other places, but in the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, that's not how it was. And specifically in South Carolina, that's not how it was. They wanted a skilled workforce, they knew where to get it, and they went and took them.
When people come to visit this museum, started by your mother,
And my father.
and your father,
Yeah.
what do you want them to take away? What do you want them to?
I want them to know how the Gullah Geechee shaped American history, U.S. history specifically, and the world. People don't know that songs that they sing in church or learned at camp or elementary school, like Michael Rowed the Boat Ashore, that is a Gullah Geechee song. The song, that we used to see in the cartoons about, nobody knows the trouble I've seen, nobody knows my sorrow. That's a Gullah Geechee song. Now, here's how those songs became part of the American songbook. During the Civil War, the Union Navy went down to Beaufort and Port Royal, South Carolina, and took that area over. It became a federal district because it had military importance. Any enslaved person in that federal district or who could get to that federal district was free. Okay? So some enterprising musicologists from the North went down to that federal district and they transcribed any song the Gullah Geechee would sing to them. During the Civil War, those songs were published in a book called Slave Songs of the United States. This book is still published today, but those are Gullah Geechee songs. Now, those are also the songs that gave birth to pretty much every American music that evolved here. So, once again, if you keep pulling on that string, it leads back to the Gullah Geechee.
How does it make you feel knowing your history and being able to share it with others?
It's just making sure that they know where something came from and the role that my people played in that. It makes me very proud. It makes me happy and joyous to share the stories with people because it's a story of sorrow, but it is also a story of resiliency and a story of joy.
What would your mom and dad think about the fact that you and your sister are still here carrying on this work?
They would expect it, but they would be very proud of us. They were always very proud of all of us.
And honestly, guys, the Gullah Museum completely blew us away. Walking into that space, you realize so quickly how much of our everyday American culture, from the music we listen to the food we eat and more, it flows directly from the deep roots and the sheer resilience of the Gullah Geechee people. Learning about how the language and the traditions are preserved through generations on these little coastal islands, it was an absolute eye-opener. It completely changes how you look at American history. So if you're anywhere near the South Carolina Lowcountry, you have to make this a stop on your own itinerary. Go listen to the stories, look at the beautiful story quilts, and support the incredible work that they're doing to keep this vibrant history alive. It truly is an experience that stays with you. Well, next week we roll into yet another state as part of our USA 250 tour. We'll continue to uncover another piece of the American story. You don't want to miss where we land next, so follow along every week by liking us on Facebook, Instagram, and even seeing the video on our YouTube channel. New stories drop every week. Listen on the free Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcast.